The slave girl knelt on the stone floor in the center of the magical circle, her body rigid with agony as Nagash intoned the Incantation of Reaping. Only 2 days before, she had arrived in the living city on a slave ship from Tsandri, taken in a raid on the barbarian lands to the far north. Bright blue eyes stared up at Nagash in mindless terror. Her mouth gaped wide in a frozen shriek of pain, revealing fine white teeth and a squirming tongue. Her shoulders struggled as she struggled for breath. The Grand Hierophant had been careful to allow her muscles just enough flexibility for her to breathe enough air so that she could remain conscious and alert. It had taken many months and countless experiments before he was capable of such precise control. Nagash's powerful voice echoed from the stone walls of his sanctum beneath the Great Pyramid as he continued his remorseless, savage chant. He spoke in Nehekhara, not in the debased, snake-like tongue of his prisoners. His knowledge of their barbaric magic had grown in leaps and bounds in the 3 years since he'd slain that hapless fool Imeb. The spilling of blood, the unwinding of a living spirit from its bindings of flesh and bone, these things were second nature to him now. The words of the ritual rang like the tolling of a bell, rising in tempo as Nagash focused his will upon the slave girl's laboring heart. Her heartbeat began to hammer in time with his chanting voice, and the air between them crackled with invisible power. The Grand Hierophant clenched his fists and felt the warmth of the girl's life force against his skin. His voice rose to an exultant shriek as the chant rose in tempo, and wisps of smoke began to curl around the slave's pale skin. Her trembling ceased. Veins stood out starkly at her temples and along the sides of her throat. Nagash felt the beat of her heart rise to a glorious crescendo. Then, her body gave a single violent spasm and exploded into a hissing green flame. Nagash plunged his hands into the seething inferno, feeling the power race along his skin as he seized the slave girl's throat. With an inhaled breath and an exertion of will, he drew her life force into him. His veins burned and her final cries rang soundlessly along his bones. It was over in a moment, and her body, drained of every drag of power, collapsed into a heap of steaming bones at Nagash's feet. This was but a prelude, a gathering of strength for the real work that was about to begin. Wrapped in ethereal mist and glowing with unholy energy, the Grand Hierophant stretched out his arms once more and turned his attention onto the wooden cage just a few feet beyond the edge of the magic circle. Dusky figures stirred inside, half hidden by the shifting shadows cast by the room's guttering oil lamps. They were siblings, a young man and a woman in the full bloom of youth and of noble birth, whom Khefru had found in the wine house near the docks. The discovery had been a stroke of luck. Nagash's requirements for his next experiment had been very specific, and he had been forced to wait months for the pair to fall into the young priest's clutches. With the last syllables of the Incantation of Reaping still echoing in the chamber, Nagash began his next ritual. The first phrases were simple enough, serving to focus the Grand Hierophant's concentration, but grew swiftly in cadence and complexity as the first stages of the transformation began. He had learned very quickly that there were limits to the power of a human soul. When Imeb breathed his last and poured out his lifeblood onto Nagash's hands, the Grand Hierophant felt his veins turn to fire and believed himself a god. But that wondrous energy faded all too quickly. A single human life could fuel a minor Druchii spell, but no more. Melchior had responded to his frustrations with a shrug. The soul was but a pull of breath compared to the wild winds of magic that fueled the Druchii's greater rituals. The warlock had known this all along. It was yet another of the barbarians' devious traps. Melchior could fulfill the letter of their agreement by teaching Nagash the incantations and rituals of Druchii magic lore, in the full knowledge that the Grand Hierophant would never amass enough power to attempt more potent spells. Such an effort would require scores, if not hundreds of souls, a process that was far too unwieldy to perform in a single rite, and too large a scale to avoid notice by Tutep and the city nobles. No doubt, Melchior had hoped that Nagash's lust for power would tempt him to recklessness and self-destruction. Instead, the Grand Hierophant began to apply his newfound powers in another direction, namely, the accumulated arcane lore of Settra's Mortuary cult. For more than 2,000 years, the cult of eternal life had plumbed the dark mysteries of life and death. Their ancient tomes were filled with theoretical rituals to harness the souls and manipulate the invisible workings of flesh and bone. Until now, however, their practical rites were minor in comparison to those of the Druchii, because lich priests depended on the gifts of the gods to fuel their incantations. All that had changed when Imheb had poured out his lifeblood over Nagash's hands. This new incantation was based upon an older rite found in the cult's body of arcane lore. Nagash had spent the better part of a year altering and refining the ritual to suit his plans. Now he would put it to the test. The arcane chant rolled like thunder from Nagash's tongue, driven by the energy stolen from the slave girl. He focused on the two shadowy forms crouching at the far end of their cage and extended his hands towards them. At once, the young siblings collapsed on the floor, moaning in fear and pain. Power flowed from his fingertips and played across their trembling forms. Nagash performed the incantation for nearly an hour until the last vestiges of stolen energy sped from his fingertips. As the rite concluded, he spoke a single name. Shebresh, he said, and lowered his arms. Silence fell, punctuated by soft, choking sounds from inside the cage, and the swish of an inkbrush from the corner of the sanctum to Nagash's left. Khefru continued to note his observations in a huge leather-bound book for several minutes after the rite was completed. Nagash's erstwhile tutors were absent, since he had begun to apply his newfound abilities to those of the Mortuary cult. The Grand Hierophant found that he required the presence of the Druchii less and less. Soon, Nagash suspected that their long-term arrangement would finally come to an end. The young priest made a final note with his brush and glanced up at his master. "Was the rite successful?" he asked. Nagash spared a final glance toward the mewling figures at the bottom of the cage and waved dismissively. "It is too early to tell," he said, striding carefully from the circle. "The transformation has only begun to take root. I shall know more when I return later tonight." The Grand Hierophant folded his arms across his chest. "Have you seen to the preparations inside the city?" Khefru nodded gravely as he capped the ink pot and set his brush aside. The past 6 years had taken a toll upon the former noble. Though still very young by Nehekhara standards, the priest had grown haggard and sunken-eyed in service to his master's increasingly dangerous pursuits. His face was sallow and puffy from too many nights spent in the winehouses searching for his master's victims, and he had taken to shaving his head to conceal the streaks of grey hair that began to sprout at his temples. The long scar on the left side of his face cut a jagged white furrow across his fleshy cheek. "All is in readiness, master," he replied. "The house has been made ready and the slaves know their tasks." Nagash studied Khefru warily. "You sound reluctant," he said. Khefru closed the tome and lifted it from the writing table. "It is not for me to say, master," he answered, returning it to a shelf laden with similar volumes. "True enough," the Grand Hierophant replied. "Tell me nonetheless." The young priest considered his words carefully. "What you are contemplating is reckless," he began. "These men are cowards and fools. They will betray you in an instant. They will have far more to gain from me than from my brother." Nagash cut in.
Just as you did, if you recall. That's not how they will see it, Khefru persisted. They have no power, no wealth or influence. Tuteb and the great houses would crush them, and they know it. No amount of persuasion will convince them otherwise.
Nagash smiled coldly.
Persuade them? Hardly. When the time comes, they will have persuaded themselves.
Khefru's gaze drifted to the cage at the far end of the room. His expression grew strained.
Haven't we tempted fate enough? He asked. I've lost count of all the people we've killed. Rumors are starting to spread through the river districts. Fate? Nagash spat. Fate is a notion weak minds use to excuse their failures.
The Grand Hierophant stepped close to the young priest.
Have you grown weak, Khefru? Our work has only just begun.
The young priest met Nagash's eyes, and his face went pale. No, master, he said quickly. I'm not weak. Command me, and I will serve. Nagash studied Khefru's face for a long moment.
Let us go then,
he said, and turned away. Khefru watched the Grand Hierophant leave the dimly lit chamber and begin the long, winding trek to the surface. A wet, gurgling cough came from the deep shadows within the cage. With a last dreadful look at the squirming forms inside, the priest hurried after his master. It was approaching midnight in the world beyond the crypt. Naru hung bright and full above the vast necropolis, limning the stone structures in ghostly silver light and creating pools of inky blackness in the narrow lanes between, while Sekhmet, the Green Witch, shone baleful and red just above the eastern horizon. Nagash and Khefru made their way alone among the houses of the dead, listening to the chatter of jackals among the poorer crypts to the southwest. They encountered no dangers on their trek through the distant road. In times past, it was not unknown for gangs of thieves and grave robbers to prowl among the vast city of tombs, but that had come to an end within the last few years. Rumors abounded in the city that something dark and terrible had taken root in Khemri's necropolis, and those who braved its streets after dark were never seen again. The Grand Hierophant had certainly not lacked for subjects in the early days of his studies, nor had his tutors lacked for entertainment. Just beyond the temple district, Khefru led his master to a predetermined alley where a palanquin and 8 nervous-looking bearers waited. Nagash ushered quickly inside, and the bearers set off at once, making their way into the merchants' district and turning north, where winehouses and dens of vice lined the side streets just south of the city's wealthy neighborhoods. The palanquin made its way unnoticed among the late-night revelers and scowling watchmen, finally turning right down a narrow valley close to Coppersmith Street. Khefru jogged ahead of the palanquin to a recessed door lit by a small, hanging oil lamp. The priest rapped softly as the bearers lowered the palanquin to the ground. With a rattle of bolts, the door swung open just as Nagash emerged into the night air. Glancing warily up and down the dark alley, the Grand Hierophant stepped quickly through the doorway into a small, rubbish-strewn courtyard.
"This hovel was the best you could find?"
he asked Khefru. "You wanted anonymity, did you not?" Khefru said archly. "Would you have preferred a manor in the noble districts, in full view of every gossiping slave and the meddlesome widow?" He surveyed the decaying home with a satisfied nod. "Places like this are common near the seedier quarters. Nobles or traders buy them up and use them for trysts and then sell them off again when the mood suits them. The locals see people come and go at all hours and don't think twice. And it's just down the street from some of your guests' favorite haunts."
Fine, fine,
Nagash snapped. He turned to the 2 slaves.
"Are all in attendance?"
he asked. "The last one arrived an hour ago, master," one slave said, as he shot the last bolt home.
"No doubt they've drunk most of the wine by now,"
Khefru said darkly. "Not a good way to begin a conspiracy, master." The Grand Hierophant ignored the priest's impertinence.
"Take me to them," he commanded the slaves.